They forgot I existed for years, no calls, no texts, not even a birthday card. But when my sister's marriage crumbled, suddenly I became the only person they remembered, not out of love or concern, but because they needed $20,000. They expected me to hand it over without question, like I always had before. But this time, I wasn't staying silent. This time, they were about to learn what happens when you treat family like a personal ATM for too long. My name is Natalie Carter, and for the first time in 32 years, I actually loved my life. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Boulder apartment, casting geometric shadows across the hardwood floors I'd saved 3 months to afford. Outside, the flatirons rose like ancient sentinels against the Colorado sky, their red sandstone faces catching the early light. It was 7:15 a.m., and I was already dressed for work, nursing my second cup of coffee while reviewing client files for the day ahead. 2 years. That's how long it had been since I'd heard my mother's voice, since I'd received a text from my sister Melissa, since anyone from Riverton, Ohio had acknowledged my existence. The silence had been deafening at first, like phantom limb syndrome. But for relationships, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call home before remembering there was no home to call anymore. But somewhere along the way, the silence had become peace. My consulting firm, Mountain Peak Solutions, occupied the 20th floor of a gleaming office building downtown. I'd built my client base from scratch, specializing in organizational restructuring for mid-sized companies. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, and most importantly, it was mine. No family drama bleeding into conference calls, no guilt trips interrupting client presentations, no emergency phone calls demanding I drop everything to solve someone else's crisis. The apartment reflected this new version of myself: clean lines, carefully chosen furniture, plants that I actually remembered to water. My savings account had a healthy balance for the first time in years. I'd even started dating again, something that had been impossible when every spare dollar and emotional reserve was being siphoned off to Ohio. During lunch breaks, I'd hike the trails around Boulder, breathing in air that didn't carry the weight of family expectations. My colleagues invited me to happy hours and weekend barbecues, and I said yes without calculating whether I could afford it or checking my phone for crisis messages from back home. I'd discovered I was actually funny when I wasn't constantly stressed about who needed what from me next. The strangest part wasn't the absence of drama, it was the absence of guilt about the absence of drama. For months after the final blow-up that had severed all contact, I'd wake up with a knot in my stomach, wondering if I was a terrible daughter, a selfish sister. But gradually, that knot had dissolved. I'd started sleeping through the night. My migraines had disappeared. I'd gained weight in a good way, finally eating regular meals instead of stress surviving on coffee and granola bars. My apartment walls were decorated with photos from hiking trips and work events, but notably absent were any family pictures. I'd packed those away in a box that now lived in the back of my bedroom closet, along with the guilt and obligation that had defined the first 30 years of my life. The consulting work had taught me to see patterns, to identify toxic dynamics in organizations and design healthier systems. It was impossible not to apply that same analytical lens to my own past. The endless financial emergencies that somehow always fell on my shoulders, the way family gatherings became exercises in managing Melissa's moods and my parents' enabling, the gradual erosion of my own needs until I'd become nothing more than a solution to other people's problems. But that was the old Natalie, the one who lived paycheck to paycheck because every windfall went to someone else's crisis. The one who canceled her own plans to manage other people's chaos. The one who apologized for setting boundaries and felt guilty for having dreams that didn't revolve around fixing her family's dysfunction. This Natalie had a retirement account. This Natalie took vacations. This Natalie had learned to let calls go to voicemail and sleep peacefully through the night. As I gathered my files for the day ahead, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had clear skin, bright eyes, and something I'd almost forgotten I possessed: contentment. 2 years of radio silence had cost me a family, but it had given me back myself. I had no idea that in less than 6 hours, everything would change. The letter was waiting for me when I returned from work at 6:30 p.m., wedged between a credit card offer and my electric bill in the cluster of mail shoved through the apartment complex's slot. I almost didn't recognize the handwriting on the envelope. It had been so long since I'd seen my mother's careful cursive. Each letter precisely formed like she'd learned in Catholic school 60 years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I tore open the envelope, standing right there in the lobby while other residents brushed past me toward the elevators. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind my mother reserved for thank you notes and funeral condolences. But this wasn't a thank you note. Natalie, I hope this letter finds you well. We haven't heard from you in such a long time. Your sister Melissa is going through a very difficult divorce right now, and the legal fees are more than she can handle on her own. She needs $20,000 to finalize everything and start fresh. I know you're doing well out there in Colorado, and I was hoping you could help family during this hard time. You know how important family is. Please call me when you get this. Love, Mom. I read it twice, then a third time. Each reading made the words more surreal, like I was translating a foreign language and kept getting the grammar wrong. No, how are you? No, we miss you. No acknowledgement of the 2-year silence or any curiosity about why it had occurred. Just a straightforward request for $20,000, delivered with the casual assumption that I would, of course, comply. The elevator ride to my apartment felt eternal. My legs carried me down the hallway and through my front door on autopilot while my brain struggled to process what I'd just read. I dropped my work bag on the kitchen counter and stared at the letter again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. $20,000. I walked to my laptop and opened my banking app, looking at my savings account balance. Yes, I had $20,000. I'd worked 60-hour weeks for 2 years to build that safety net, saying no to dinners out and weekend trips, buying generic groceries and shopping at thrift stores. That money represented security, independence, the ability to sleep at night knowing I wouldn't end up back where I started financially and emotionally bankrupt from other people's choices. But what stunned me wasn't the amount, it was the assumption. They hadn't asked if I could help. They'd simply informed me that help was needed and I would provide it. Like calling a utility company to restore service efficient, transactional, no emotional complexity required. I set the letter on my coffee table and paced the length of my living room, which suddenly felt too small to contain the anger building in my chest. Through my windows, Boulder's evening lights twinkled like stars, and I remembered why I'd moved here to build a life where I was more than an emergency contact for other people's disasters. The silence from my family hadn't been mutual. I'd sent Christmas cards the first year, birthday texts that went unanswered, an email with photos from a hiking trip that generated zero response. I'd slowly stopped reaching out when it became clear that communication was a one-way street that only opened when they needed something. And now, after 2 years of treating me like I didn't exist, they'd remembered my name because they needed my bank account. I read the letter one more time, paying attention to what wasn't there. No mention of what had caused Melissa's divorce, though knowing my sister. I could guess. No apology for the years of silence. No recognition that asking for $20,000 might require some explanation or context. Just the expectation that I would write a check because family is important. The irony was breathtaking. Family was so important that they could ignore me for 2 years. Family was so important that they could reach out only when they needed money. Family was so important that I was expected to bankroll Melissa's fresh start while they'd never acknowledged mine. I thought about Melissa's last text to me, sent 3 years ago during what I now realized had been the beginning of the end. Stop being so dramatic about everything. Not everything is about you. That had been her response when I'd asked why I wasn't invited to our cousin's wedding, a wedding where I later learned I'd been deliberately excluded because Melissa had told everyone I was going through a difficult phase and probably wouldn't be fun to be around. My phone rang, startling me from the memory. Mom's number flashed on the screen the first time she'd called in over 2 years. My finger hovered over the decline button, but curiosity won. "Hello, Mom." "Natalie." "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you got my letter. I wasn't sure if we had the right address." Her voice sounded exactly the same, warm, slightly breathless, as if she'd just rushed in from the garden, as if 2 years hadn't passed, as if this was a normal conversation between a mother and daughter who talked regularly. "You have the right address," I said carefully. "Good, good. So you saw about Melissa's situation. It's just awful, honey. The divorce has been so hard on her, and now with these legal bills." She trailed off, waiting for me to fill the silence with an offer to help. I didn't. "20,000 is a lot of money. Mom." "Oh, I know it sounds like a lot, but I remember you telling us about that promotion, and with your consulting business doing so well." Another pause. "You know how family helps family." The casual reference to my promotion information I'd shared in an email that had gone completely unanswered made my jaw clench. They'd been keeping track of my financial progress while maintaining radio silence about everything else. "I'll need to think about it," I said. The disappointment in her voice was immediate and sharp. "Think about it, Natalie. This is your sister. She's family." "I'm aware she's my sister, Mom." "Then you know this is important. She needs this money, and you're the only one who can help." There it was, the weight of being the solution to someone else's problem, delivered with the same guilt-laden expectation that had defined my entire relationship with my family. But this time, something had shifted. This time, I wasn't the same person who had always said yes. I said I need to think about it. "I'll call you back." I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. Outside my window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that I'd learned to associate with peace. But peace, I was beginning to realize, was about to become a luxury I could no longer afford. I couldn't sleep that night. At 2:15 a.m., I gave up pretending and padded to my kitchen, making coffee in the dark while my mind churned through memories I'd spent 2 years trying to forget. But this time, instead of pushing them away, I decided to face them head on. I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed "The Real Cost of Family." What came next was a methodical accounting of my financial relationship with the people who had raised me, a relationship that, I was beginning to realize, had been entirely one-sided for longer than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. 5 years ago, Dad's gambling debts. He'd gotten in over his head at the local casino, and Mom had called me crying at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, begging me to help before they lost the house. I'd liquidated my entire emergency fund, $8,000, and wired it the next morning. The thank you had lasted exactly one phone call. The promise to pay me back had evaporated within a month. 4 years ago, Melissa's business opportunity. She'd wanted to start a boutique with her friend Sarah, convinced they'd make a fortune selling overpriced jewelry to suburban housewives. She needed $5,000 for initial inventory. I'd cashed out my modest 401k, paying early withdrawal penalties that cost me another $1,000. The boutique had closed within 6 months, but somehow the failure was Sarah's fault, the economy's fault, everyone's fault except Melissa's. My $5,000 had vanished into costume jewelry that ended up at garage sales. 3.5 years ago, Mom lost her job at the school district due to budget cuts. While she looked for new work, I'd sent $500 a month for 8 months, $4,000 total to help with groceries and utilities. When she finally found another position, the monthly payments had simply stopped without discussion. No final thank you, no acknowledgement of what those payments had meant to my own financial stability. 3 years ago, Melissa's son needed special tutoring for his learning disabilities. The sessions cost $300 a week, and Melissa's insurance didn't cover them. I'd paid for an entire semester $3,600 because it's for your nephew, and education is important. When I'd asked how the tutoring was going months later, I'd learned Melissa had stopped taking him after 6 weeks, but hadn't bothered to tell me. The remaining money had disappeared into her general expenses. 2.5 years ago, Dad's truck broke down, and he needed reliable transportation for his new job. I'd co-signed a loan for $12,000 because his credit was shot from the gambling debts. When he'd defaulted after 8 months, guess whose credit score had taken the hit? I'd had to pay off the remaining $7,000 to protect my financial future. The list went on. Emergency dental work for Mom, Melissa's credit card debt from her shopping addiction, Dad's legal fees when his gambling had gotten him into trouble with some unsavory characters. Each crisis had been presented as a one-time emergency, a family member reaching out in their darkest hour, desperately needing help that only I could provide. I added up the numbers 3 times, certain I'd made an error, but the total remained stubbornly, sickeningly consistent $26,400 over 5 years. More than $26,000 that I'd given freely, often sacrificing my own stability to provide money that had come from my savings, my retirement funds, my emergency reserves, money that had been requested with tears and promises and guilt trips about family loyalty, money that had never been repaid, barely acknowledged, and certainly never appreciated. But the financial cost was only part of the equation. I opened a second document and began listing the emotional price I'd paid for being the family's designated savior. Canceled vacations because the money had gone to someone else's crisis. Relationships that had suffered because I was always stressed about the next emergency call. Career opportunities I'd turned down because I couldn't afford to take risks with unstable income when everyone depended on me as their safety net. The constant anxiety of knowing my phone could ring at any moment with a new disaster that would somehow become my responsibility to solve. And what had I received in return? Radio silence when I'd needed support during my own difficult times. Exclusion from family gatherings when I wasn't needed for financial rescue missions. Criticism for being selfish or dramatic when I'd occasionally expressed frustration about the one-way nature of our relationships. The pattern was so clear it was embarrassing that I hadn't seen it before. I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was a resource to be managed. When I was useful, I was beloved and essential. When I tried to establish boundaries or ask for consideration, I was difficult and ungrateful. When I'd finally stopped being available for financial emergencies, I'd simply ceased to exist in their world. Now Melissa needed $20,000. And suddenly, I existed again. I stared at the numbers on my screen until they blurred together. $26,000. 5 years of being used, 2 years of being ignored. And now they expected me to hand over another $20,000 without question, as if the previous pattern of taking without giving had been perfectly reasonable. The sun was rising outside my windows, painting the mountains in soft pastels that usually filled me with peace. But this morning, I felt something different building in my chest, something colder and more purposeful than the hurt I'd carried for years. For the first time since I'd received my mother's letter, I smiled. They thought they were dealing with the old Natalie, the one who said yes reflexively, who prioritized everyone else's needs above her own, who could be guilted into compliance with appeals to family loyalty. They had no idea that person had died 2 years ago in the silence they'd imposed. The new Natalie had learned to value herself. The new Natalie had boundaries. The new Natalie understood that real family didn't treat each other like automated teller machines. And the new Natalie was about to teach them the difference between family and financial exploitation. I saved both documents and closed my laptop. It was time to get ready for work, but for the first time in years, I felt truly awake. The anger that had been simmering since yesterday evening had crystallized into something much more powerful clarity. They wanted $20,000. They were going to get something far more valuable and far more expensive. They were going to get the truth. The call came at 3:45 p.m. while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office. The number wasn't one I recognized, but the area code was familiar. Riverton, Ohio. Natalie, it's your cousin Rebecca. I hadn't spoken to Rebecca in over a year, not since she'd stopped responding to my attempts to maintain contact with the extended family. Her voice sounded strained, almost conspiratorial. Hi, Rebecca. This is unexpected. I know. I know. Listen, I'm calling because I heard something at Sunday dinner that didn't sit right with me. She paused, and I could hear children playing in the background. Were you really planning to pay for Melissa's entire divorce? My grip tightened on the phone. What exactly did you hear? Melissa was there with Mom and your parents, talking about how relieved she was that you were going to cover all her legal fees. She said you'd already agreed to write a check for $20,000, and she was going on about how she could finally get rid of that deadbeat husband without worrying about money. The words hit me like ice water. She said I'd already agreed. Yeah, and Natalie, she was talking about you like you were some kind of trust fund. She kept saying how lucky she was to have a sister who made good money and didn't have real responsibilities like kids or a mortgage. Rebecca's voice dropped lower. She also said you never really needed the money anyway because you just spent it on expensive hobbies and selfish stuff. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar burn of betrayal, but sharper this time. What else? This is the part that really bothered me. Your mom was there, and she was nodding along, saying how Natalie always comes through for family and how you'd learned to be generous over the years. But then Melissa said something about how you used to be difficult about money, but that you'd grown out of that phase. Difficult about money. Yeah, like you were some spoiled kid who'd learned to share her toys. And then, Rebecca hesitated. Then Melissa said she was glad you'd stopped being so needy and emotional about wanting to be included in family stuff, because it made asking for help so much easier. Rebecca, did anyone mention the money I've given them over the years? Money you've given them. What do you mean? Of course. They'd never told anyone about my financial support. In the family narrative, I was apparently the distant, selfish sister who had finally learned to be generous, not the person who'd been bankrolling their emergencies for half a decade. Never mind, what else did they say? Well, your Aunt Linda was there, and she mentioned that she hadn't seen you at any family gatherings lately. Melissa laughed and said you'd gotten too good for Riverton after your promotion, that you thought you were better than everyone because you lived in Colorado now. My hands were shaking now. And no one questioned that. Your mom jumped in and said you'd always been independent and that some people need space to find themselves. But the way she said it, it was like she was making excuses for a rebellious teenager, not talking about her adult daughter. The picture was becoming clear, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Not only had my family erased my contributions from their collective memory, but they'd actively constructed a story where I was the problem's selfish, difficult, emotionally needy who had finally learned to behave properly by giving them money and staying away. Natalie, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Rebecca, why are you telling me this? She sighed heavily. Because it felt wrong. I remember you from when we were kids, and you were always the one helping everyone, always trying to keep the peace. When you stopped coming around, I figured there was more to the story than what Melissa was saying. And after hearing her talk today, I don't know. It just felt like there were pieces missing. There are a lot of pieces missing. Look, I don't want to get in the middle of family drama, but I thought you should know what's being said, especially since Melissa seemed pretty confident that you were going to pay for everything. She was already talking about taking a vacation after the divorce is finalized, said she deserved it after everything she's been through. A vacation, funded by my $20,000, of course. Thank you for calling, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. Are you okay? You sound... I'm fine, just processing some things. After I hung up, I sat in my office chair, staring out at the Colorado mountains that had become my sanctuary. The sun was beginning its descent toward the peaks, casting long shadows across the landscape that had welcomed me when my own family wouldn't. So this was how they'd spent the last 2 years not missing me, not wondering why I'd pulled away, but actively rewriting history to make my absence their choice instead of mine. I was the difficult sister who'd needed to learn proper behavior, not the exploited daughter who'd finally found the strength to leave. They'd turned my financial support into evidence of my moral growth rather than acknowledging it as generosity. They'd transformed my boundaries into character flaws and my success into arrogance. They'd made me the villain in a story where I'd been nothing but the victim. But the most insulting part was how confident they were that I'd continue playing my assigned role. Melissa was already planning her post-divorce vacation, certain that her personal ATM would function as expected. She'd announced my financial commitment to the family without even asking, so sure of my compliance that she was making plans with money I hadn't agreed to give. I opened my laptop and created a new document. This one wasn't for my own processing, this one was for research. Over the next hour, I methodically went through my email archives, my banking records, and my phone history. Every transfer, every emergency loan, every crisis payment, I documented it all with dates, amounts, and screenshots. I found the emails I'd sent trying to maintain contact after the initial silence, the birthday wishes that had gone unanswered, the holiday cards that had been ignored. I also found something else, a text thread with Melissa from 3 years ago, right around the time I'd started being excluded from family events. I'd forgotten about it, but reading it now with fresh eyes, the manipulation was crystal clear. Melissa had systematically poisoned the family against me while simultaneously ensuring I remained available for financial emergencies. She'd convinced everyone I was selfish and distant while privately maintaining contact just enough to keep the money flowing. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that time and distance had made me weaker, more desperate for family approval, more willing to pay any price to be accepted back into the fold. She had no idea that time and distance had made me stronger. And she was about to find out just how strong. I called my mother first, at 8:30 p.m. Colorado time, when I knew she'd be settling in for her evening television routine. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with anticipation. "Natalie, I was hoping you'd call back. Have you had a chance to think about Melissa's situation?" "I have, actually, but first, I wanted to clarify something. I heard through the grapevine that Melissa's been telling people I already agreed to pay for her divorce." The pause was telling long enough for me to count 3 heartbeats before she responded. "Well, honey, you know how Melissa is when she's stressed. She's just so hopeful that family will come through for her." "That's interesting, Mom, because hope and certainty are 2 different things. Has she been planning expenses based on money I haven't agreed to give?" Another pause. "I think she's just trying to stay positive during a difficult time." "Let me ask you something else. Do you remember the $8,000 I gave Dad for his gambling debts 5 years ago?" "Natalie, I don't see how that's relevant to—" "Do you remember it, Mom?" "Of course I remember. You helped us when we needed it." "And the $5,000 for Melissa's boutique, the $4,000 I sent you when you lost your job, the $3,600 for her son's tutoring, the $7,000 I had to pay when Dad defaulted on his truck loan." The silence stretched longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its warmth. "I don't understand why you're bringing up old history." "Natalie." "Old history, Mom. That's over $26,000 I've given this family in 5 years. 26,000? And now you want another 20,000. But somehow I'm the one who needs to learn to be generous." "Who told you that?" The defensive edge in her voice confirmed everything Rebecca had shared. "It doesn't matter who told me, Mom. What matters is that it's apparently what you believe." "Natalie, family helps family." "You've always known that." "Right. Family helps family. So tell me, when exactly did family help me? When I was working 3 jobs to get through college while Melissa partied through community college on Dad's dime, when I was struggling to build my career while sending money home for everyone else's emergencies, when I needed emotional support during my own difficult times and got radio silence instead. That's not fair. We've always been proud of you. Proud enough to exclude me from family gatherings, proud enough to ignore my calls and texts for 2 years, proud enough to lie about why I'm not around anymore. We haven't lied about anything. Really, because I heard that Melissa told everyone I think I'm too good for Riverton, that I'm selfish and needed to learn to share, that I used to be needy and emotional about wanting to be included. None of that sounds like pride to me. Mom." The silence was deafening. I could almost hear her scrambling for a response that would somehow justify the unjustifiable. Melissa is going through a hard time right now. Sometimes people say things when they're upset. For 2 years. Mom. She's been upset for 2 years. I think you're overreacting. $26,000. Mom. 2 years of silence. And now you expect another $20,000 with no discussion, no acknowledgement, no apology. If that's overreacting, then I guess I am. So you're saying you won't help your sister? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment, the guilt trip that had worked for 32 years, the manipulation that had kept me trapped in the role of family savior. I'm saying that I'm done being treated like an ATM with legs. Natalie Carter, that is not fair. We are your family. No, Mom. Family doesn't work this way. Family doesn't take and take and take while giving nothing back. Family doesn't rewrite history to make the victim look like the villain. Family doesn't disappear for 2 years and then resurface when they need money. If that's how you really feel, then maybe the distance has been good for all of us. The threat was implicit, but clear: comply or remain cut off. It was the same ultimatum that had controlled me for years, wrapped in the language of family loyalty. Maybe it has been good, Mom. Maybe I needed to learn what my life looked like without people who only valued me for my bank account. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking as I scrolled to Melissa's number. We hadn't spoken in over 2 years, but I had things to say that couldn't wait any longer. She answered after 4 rings, her voice cautious but hopeful. Natalie, Mom said you might call. Did she also tell you what we discussed? She said you were being difficult about helping with my divorce. The victim tone was already creeping into her voice, the same martyred inflection she'd perfected as a teenager. Difficult, is that what we're calling it when someone asks questions before handing over $20,000? Look, I know it's a lot of money, but I'm really desperate here. This divorce is killing me financially, and you're the only one who can help. I'm the only one who can help, or I'm the only one with money you can access. What's the difference? The honesty was breathtaking. She didn't even pretend there was a distinction between needing help and needing money. The difference, Melissa, is that people who need help ask for it. They don't announce to the entire family that they're getting it before having the conversation. I was just being optimistic. You were counting on me saying yes because I always say yes, because you've trained me to say yes by making me feel guilty when I don't. That's not true. Isn't it? Tell me, Melissa, what have you told the family about why I haven't been around? Another pause. I don't know what you mean. I mean the stories about me thinking I'm too good for Riverton, about me being selfish and needy, about me finally learning to share. Should I go on? I've never said you were selfish. The lie came so easily. I almost admired her commitment to it. Right. And I suppose you never told anyone that I used to be difficult about money, but I'd grown out of that phase. Natalie, I think you're misunderstanding. No, Melissa, I think I'm finally understanding perfectly. You've spent 2 years rewriting history to make yourself look like the patient victim of my character flaws, while simultaneously keeping me on standby for financial emergencies. That's not what happened. Then tell me what did happen. Tell me why I wasn't invited to Christmas. Tell me why my texts went unanswered. Tell me why the only time anyone remembers my existence is when money is needed. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Are you going to help me or not? She finally asked, dropping all pretense. There it was, the real question, stripped of manipulation and false sentiment. She didn't want a relationship. She didn't want to repair what we'd broken. She just wanted to know if the ATM was still functional. No, Melissa, I'm not. Then I guess we have nothing left to talk about. She hung up before I could respond, but that was fine. I'd said everything I needed to say. I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built without them, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete clarity about who my family really was. They weren't evil people. They were just people who had learned that I would solve their problems without requiring anything in return. And when I'd finally stopped being useful, they'd simply erased me from their story. But erasure worked both ways, and I was about to teach them that the pen was indeed mightier than the sword. The next morning, I called in sick to work. It wasn't entirely a lie I was sick, just not in the way my boss would understand. I was sick of being lied about, sick of being used, and sick of letting other people control the narrative of my life. I spread everything across my dining room table like a detective building a case. Bank statements going back 6 years, email printouts, screenshots of text conversations, credit reports showing the damage from Dad's defaulted loan, a timeline I'd constructed showing every financial transaction alongside every family event I'd been excluded from. The pattern was even more damning when laid out chronologically. Each time I'd provided financial help, there had been a brief period of inclusion phone calls, invitations, expressions of gratitude. Then, as soon as the crisis passed, the warmth would fade, the calls would become less frequent, the invitations would stop coming, until the next emergency, when suddenly I'd be essential again. I started with my banking records, photographing every wire transfer, every cashier's check, every electronic payment that had flowed from my accounts to theirs. The numbers were stark in black and white: $8,000 to Dad for gambling debts, $5,000 to Melissa for her failed boutique, $4,000 in monthly payments to Mom during her unemployment, $3,600 for my nephew's tutoring that had lasted 6 weeks instead of a full semester. Each transaction told a story of manipulation dressed up as family crisis: the urgent phone calls, the tears, the promises that this would be the last time, that they'd pay me back, that they just needed to get through this rough patch, promises that had evaporated the moment the money cleared. I pulled up my email archives and printed every message I'd sent trying to maintain contact after they'd started freezing me out. Birthday wishes that went unacknowledged, holiday cards that generated no response, invitations to visit that were ignored, a pattern of me reaching out and them pulling away, except when they needed something. The most damning evidence was a text thread with Melissa from 2.5 years ago. I'd asked why I wasn't invited to our cousin's graduation party, and her response had been brutal in its honesty. "Not everything is about you, Natalie. Sometimes we just want to have fun without someone making everything dramatic and difficult." But 6 weeks later, she'd texted me at 11:45 p.m., crying about her son's learning difficulties and begging for money for tutoring. The shift in tone was so dramatic it read like messages from 2 different people. I created a timeline document, matching every financial transaction with family events happening around the same time. The pattern was sickeningly clear. September 2019, paid Dad's gambling debt, $8,000. October 2019, invited to Thanksgiving. January 2020, co-signed Dad's truck loan. February 2020, invited to cousin's wedding. June 2020, paid for Melissa's boutique, $5,000. July 2020, included in family vacation planning. August 2020, started sending Mom monthly payments. September 2020, March 2021, regular family calls. March 2021, paid for nephew's tutoring, $3,600. April 2021, invited to Easter dinner. But then, when I'd started asking questions about the tutoring money and expressing frustration about being taken for granted, the invitations had stopped. The calls had become less frequent. By late 2021, I'd been essentially erased from family gatherings. The final piece of evidence was the most recent Rebecca's phone call, confirming that they'd been actively lying about me to extended family while assuming I'd continue funding their emergencies. I sat back and looked at the evidence spread across my table. It wasn't just a case of family taking advantage, it was a systematic pattern of financial and emotional manipulation spanning years. They'd trained me to associate their love with my usefulness, then gradually withdrew that love when I'd started setting boundaries. But the beautiful thing about evidence was that it spoke for itself. I opened my laptop and began crafting what would become their reckoning, not an angry rant, not an emotional breakdown, but a clear, factual presentation of what had really happened over the past 6 years. I started with a simple introduction. For those who have heard that I'm selfish and distant from my family, I thought you might be interested in the full story. Then, I laid out the timeline. Every financial transaction, with dates and amounts. Every excluded invitation, with context about what money had been requested around the same time. Every attempt I'd made to maintain contact, with screenshots of unanswered messages. I included the text where Melissa had called me dramatic and difficult, followed immediately by her desperate plea for tutoring money 6 weeks later. I showed the pattern of inclusion and exclusion that perfectly correlated with financial emergencies and their resolution. Most importantly, I documented their current behavior, the assumption that I'd pay $20,000 without discussion, the lies they'd told about my character to justify my absence, the vacation Melissa was planning with money she'd announced I would provide. I kept the tone calm and factual, no name-calling, no emotional manipulation, just a straightforward presentation of documented facts. I let the evidence speak for itself, because the evidence was damning enough. The hardest part was the conclusion. After years of trying to preserve some version of family relationships, I was about to burn every bridge, but as I looked at the evidence spread before me, I realized those bridges had been burned long ago. I'd just been too afraid to admit it. I share this not for sympathy, but for clarity. I wrote, "For 2 years, I've been painted as the selfish sister who abandoned her family. The truth is that I was abandoned long before I stopped reaching out. I was only valued for my financial contributions, and when I began questioning that dynamic, I was systematically excluded and lied about. Today, my sister needs $20,000 for her divorce, and the family has announced that I'll be providing it without bothering to ask me first. They're so confident in my compliance that plans are already being made for how to spend money I haven't agreed to give. This ends now." I saved the document and leaned back in my chair. Outside my windows, Boulder was waking up to another beautiful Colorado morning. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, a reminder that some things were bigger than family drama and financial manipulation. But some things were also worth fighting for, and my right to be treated with dignity, rather than as a renewable resource, was definitely worth fighting for. I looked at my phone, thinking about the family group chat I'd been removed from 2 years ago, the social media accounts that had blocked me, the extended family who'd been fed lies about my character. They thought they'd controlled the narrative for 2 years. It was time to set the record straight. I opened my contacts and began selecting recipients. This story deserved a wider audience than they'd given me credit for. And I was about to make sure it got one. I set up my phone camera at 10:30 a.m., positioning it carefully on my kitchen counter with the Colorado mountains visible through the window behind me. Natural lighting, clean background, no distractions. If I was going to burn this bridge, I was going to do it professionally. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but when I hit record, the words came naturally, fueled by 2 years of suppressed truth and a lifetime of being undervalued. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Carter, and I want to tell you a story about family, money, and the lies people tell when they think no one is keeping track. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact, like I was presenting a business proposal rather than dismantling my family's carefully constructed narrative. 2 days ago, I received a letter from my mother asking me to pay $20,000 for my sister Melissa's divorce, not asking if I could help, but informing me that help was needed and I would provide it. But that's not the surprising part. The surprising part is that my sister had already told the family I'd agreed to pay, even though she'd never asked me. I held up the letter, letting the camera focus on my mother's handwriting. Now, you might be wondering why this is such a big deal. After all, family helps family, right? Well, let me show you what family helping family has looked like for the past 6 years. I pulled out my first bank statement, the one showing the $8,000 wire transfer to my father. September 15th, 2019. $8,000 to cover my father's gambling debts. Emergency situation. They said. Just this once. They said. They'd pay me back. They said. I set the statement aside. Spoiler alert, they didn't. One by one, I displayed the evidence. Each bank statement, each wire transfer, each documented transaction while I explained the circumstances that had led to it. January 2020, $5,000 for my sister's boutique that closed within 6 months. March 2021, $3,600 for my nephew's tutoring that stopped after 6 weeks, though no one bothered to tell me. And here's my personal favorite $7,000 I had to pay when my father defaulted on a car loan I'd co-signed for him. I paused, letting the numbers sink in. The total $26,400 over 5 years, none of it repaid, most of it barely acknowledged once the crisis passed. Then I pulled out the text messages, the unanswered emails, the evidence of systematic exclusion. But here's where it gets interesting. Every time I gave money, I was temporarily welcomed back into the family, phone calls, invitations, expressions of gratitude, but as soon as the emergency passed, I'd be gradually frozen out again. And when I started asking questions about repayment or expressing frustration about being taken for granted, I was told I was being dramatic and difficult. I held up my phone, showing Melissa's text calling me dramatic, followed by her desperate plea for money 6 weeks later. This pattern continued until I finally stopped participating. I moved to Colorado, built a new life, and for 2 years, I heard nothing from my family. No Christmas calls, no birthday wishes, no interest in my life whatsoever. Until this week, when they suddenly remembered I existed because my sister needs money. I leaned forward slightly, my voice gaining intensity without losing control. But the really impressive part is what they've been telling people about why I'm not around. According to my family, I think I'm too good for my hometown. I'm selfish and needed to learn how to share. I was emotionally needy about wanting to be included in family events. None of them mentioned the $26,000 I gave them. None of them mentioned that I was excluded from family gatherings after questioning why money only flowed one direction. They've rewritten history to make me the problem. I pulled out the timeline I'd created, holding it up to the camera. This is a timeline showing every financial transaction alongside every family event I was excluded from. Notice the pattern: money flows out, invitations stop coming, crisis hits. Suddenly I'm family again. Crisis passes, back to being ignored. I set the timeline aside and looked directly into the camera. So when my mother's letter arrived asking for $20,000, not asking if I could help, but assuming I would, I realized nothing had changed. I'm still not a daughter or a sister. I'm still just a resource to be managed. And my sister is so confident in my compliance that she's already planning a vacation with money I haven't agreed to give. I paused, letting that sink in. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about the money. $20,000 won't bankrupt me. This is about dignity. This is about being valued for who I am, not what I can provide. This is about refusing to participate in a relationship where I'm only remembered when bills need to be paid. I held up my hands, showing them empty. So, here's my answer to my family's request. No. No more money. No more being the solution to everyone else's problems while being treated like I don't exist. No more letting you rewrite history to make yourselves look like victims of my character flaws. I leaned back, my voice becoming almost conversational. I'm sharing this because for 2 years, you've been telling people that I abandoned my family. The truth is that I was abandoned long before I stopped reaching out. I was only valued for my bank account, and when I started questioning that dynamic, I was systematically erased from your lives. I stood up, the camera following me as I gestured toward the evidence spread across my table. Everything I've shown you is documented. Bank statements, text messages, emails, all of it real, all of it verifiable. I'm not asking for sympathy or support. I'm simply setting the record straight. I sat back down, looking directly into the camera for my closing statement. To my family, if you're watching this, you trained me to believe that love was conditional on my usefulness. It took me 30 years to realize that's not love, that's exploitation. You can keep telling people I'm selfish and dramatic. The evidence speaks for itself. I reached toward the camera. And to everyone else, sometimes the people who call you family are the ones who understand you least. Sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's self-preservation. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the people who claim to love you. I stopped the recording and sat in my quiet kitchen, heart pounding but mind clear. The video was 12 minutes long, 12 minutes that would change everything. I uploaded it to a private YouTube link, then began crafting the message I'd send to my extended family, friends, and everyone who'd heard Melissa's version of events. The message was simple. For those who have wondered about my absence from family events, this explains everything. The video contains documented evidence of what really happened over the past 6 years. At 2:15 p.m., I hit send to 37 people. By 4:30 p.m., my phone was ringing nonstop. The reckoning had begun. The first call came at 4:32 p.m. from my Aunt Linda, her voice shaking with what I assumed was anger until I realized she was crying. "Natalie, honey, I had no idea. I am so sorry. We all thought. Melissa said you'd gotten too successful and didn't want to associate with us anymore." The calls didn't stop. Uncle Mark, furious that he'd been lied to for 2 years. Cousin Rebecca, vindicated in her suspicions but horrified by the extent of the manipulation. Even some of my parents' neighbors, who'd seen the video after it was shared in local Facebook groups. By 6 p.m., 23 people had called or texted. Not one of them was from my immediate family. My mother finally called at 8:45 p.m. Her voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "Natalie, you need to take that video down immediately. You're embarrassing this entire family." "I'm embarrassing the family, not the part where you've been lying about me for 2 years. "We never lied about anything. We didn't share every private detail of our family business." "Private details, Mom. You told people I thought I was too good for Riverton. You let Melissa spread stories about me being selfish and dramatic. You erased $26,000 of financial support from your collective memory. How is any of that private?" "That money was given freely. No one forced you to help." The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, caught red-handed in years of lies and manipulation, she was trying to gaslight me. "You're right, Mom. No one forced me, just like no one is forcing me to take the video down. If you don't remove it, don't bother calling this house again." "I haven't called that house in 2 years. Mom, you called me when you needed money. There's a difference." She hung up. Melissa called 20 minutes later, her voice shrill with panic. "Natalie, what the hell is wrong with you? Do you have any idea what you've done? People are calling me, asking about money you supposedly gave us. You're making me look like some kind of gold digger." "I'm not making you look like anything. Melissa, I'm showing people what you actually are." "You're a vindictive bitch. You know that this is exactly why we stopped including you in things. You always have to make everything about you." $26,000. Melissa, $26,000 I gave this family over 5 years, and you have the nerve to call me vindictive for finally telling the truth about it. That money was nothing to you. You have a good job, no kids, no real responsibilities. "Stop!" My voice cut through her rant like ice. "Just stop. Do you hear yourself? You're proving every point I made in that video." "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family." "No, Melissa. You destroyed this family when you decided I was worth more as an ATM than as a sister. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." She hung up, but not before I heard her sobbing. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no sadness, just a profound sense of relief, like setting down a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The calls continued for 3 days. Extended family members who wanted to apologize for believing the lies, family friends who were horrified by what they'd learned. Even Melissa's ex-husband called to thank me apparently. My video had given him crucial insight into her financial irresponsibility that would help his custody case. But the most meaningful call came from Rebecca on Friday evening. "Natalie, I wanted you to know Melissa showed up at Mom's house today demanding that everyone call you and make you take the video down. When no one agreed, she threw a complete tantrum. Started screaming about how unfair it was that everyone was taking your side, how you'd always been the favorite, how she deserved better treatment. She said I was the favorite. Oh, it gets better. She said you'd manipulated everyone by keeping receipts and making her look bad, that you'd planned this whole thing to hurt her when she was already down. I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in days. So even now, she's the victim. Even now. But here's the thing. Natalie, nobody bought it. Not one person. Your Uncle Mark actually told her she should be ashamed of herself and that she owed you a debt she could never repay. She left crying. And honestly, I don't think she'll be welcome at many family gatherings going forward. And my parents. They're not talking to anyone right now. I think they're too embarrassed. But the damage is done. Everyone knows the truth now. After I hung up, I stood on my balcony watching the sunset behind the Colorado mountains. The peaks were painted in shades of gold and pink, the same colors that had welcomed me to Boulder 2 years ago when I'd fled Ohio with a broken heart and empty bank account. The same mountains that had witnessed my healing, my growth, my transformation from victim to survivor. My phone buzzed with another text from a family member I hadn't heard from in years, expressing support and regret for believing the lies. I read it, smiled, and put the phone away. Tomorrow, I would wake up in the life I'd built for myself, a life where I was valued for who I was, not what I could provide, where my worth wasn't measured in dollars transferred or crises solved, where the people who claimed to love me actually showed it through their actions, not just their demands. The video had over 10,000 views now, shared far beyond my original 37 recipients. Melissa's social media accounts had gone dark. My parents' phone had apparently been ringing nonstop with calls from people who wanted to hear their side of the story, a side they seemed reluctant to share. I'd achieved something I'd never thought possible. I'd taken control of my own narrative. For 32 years, other people had defined who I was and what I owed them. Finally, I'd stood up and said, "No, this is who I am. This is what really happened, and I refuse to be diminished by your lies anymore." The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. In the distance, the lights of Boulder twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life being lived on its own terms. I'd learned something important these past few days. Family isn't about blood or obligation or who you're supposed to love. Family is about who chooses to love you back, who values your presence in their life, who treats you with dignity and respect. By that definition, my family wasn't in Ohio. My family was here in the colleagues who'd covered for me when I needed time to process, in the friends who'd listened without judgment, in the life I'd built where I mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with my bank account. The old Natalie would have felt guilty about the pain my truth had caused, but the new Natalie understood that some pain is necessary for healing, like setting a broken bone or cleaning out an infected wound. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes justice looks like consequences. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be complicit in your own diminishment. I'd finally learned the difference between being used and being loved. And I'd never forget it again. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect. Please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about family dynamics, boundaries, and standing up for yourself. Your stories and perspectives always inspire me.